Hey, Christian philosopher Christopher here, and I am at a beautiful university campus today reading The Existence of God. Do you ever wonder whether one of God's divine attributes is more sort of fundamental than another or follows from one of the other? For instance, what's the relationship between God's omniscience, his omnipotence, and his moral perfection? Well, Swinburne argues that God's moral goodness follows from his perfect freedom, his being able to choose amongst relevant actions and freely choose amongst those relevant actions. And he's not influenced. Perfect freedom means he's not influenced by irrational factors. God has all the rational sort of factors and reasons before him. And then you have that God's omniscient. He knows all true propositions. So what Swinburne argues in this little passage in the chapter called The Intrinsic Probability of Theism goes as follows. Given that moral judgments have truth values, an omniscient person will know them. Why? Because an omniscient person knows all truths. His judgments about which actions are morally bad and which actions are morally good will be true judgments. So we've moved from what God knows to what God judges about them, and perhaps his knowledge of which is a good action and which is a bad action is constituted by his judgment that it is a good action or that it is a bad action. Hence, a perfectly free and omniscient being can never do actions that are morally bad and will always do the best action or an equal best action or a best kind or an equal best kind of action. I like how Swinburne does that. He covers all the possibilities. But otherwise, all that follows from his nature is that he will do a good action. Since there could not be a morally better being than a being of this kind, it is surely right to call such a being perfectly good. So God's perfect goodness follows from his omniscience and his perfect freedom. I conclude that theism postulates one person of a very simple kind, a person who is essentially omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly free and eternal. Such a being will necessarily be an omnipresent spirit, creator of all things, and perfectly good. Now, Swinburne, before this, you can read this for yourself. The exact page that I'm referencing is 105 and 106. That's where I quoted. But prior to this, Swinburne has gone through all these possibilities about why basically God must choose the best overall action. He goes through all these different things that actually are pretty complicated. But at the bottom, at sort of the end of the day, he argues that God, in perfect freedom and knowledge of what's good and bad, will always choose the morally best, morally good action. He will choose the best action, and because he knows all moral truths. So this is an interesting hypothesis. I'd be curious to hear what you think. Do you think it's true that God's perfect moral goodness follows from his omniscience and his perfect freedom? Or do you think there's another relation amongst his divine properties, such that perhaps moral goodness is fundamental and maybe his perfect freedom and omniscience follows from that? Love to hear your thoughts. Leave them in the comments and keep on thinking critically about the big questions concerning God and Christianity.